Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the Nest virtual workshop offering on grief and loss with Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. We're so glad to have you here with us today. My name is Allison Blair. I'm the program coordinator for the Nest Foundation. And whether you're new to Nest or you've worked with us before, I would love to invite my colleague, Amy Collins, to speak a little bit about our organization and what we do. Amy?
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody, welcome. I know that I will keep this as brief as possible while filling new folks in who are unfamiliar with Nest services, since we're all here for Mary Frances, myself included. So Nest is a nonprofit. We, on a national level, work with school districts, sometimes individual schools, but typically with districts, training teachers on a comprehensive violence prevention program. We have a forthcoming K through 12 program that is in the final stages of completion, but have a current middle school through high school curriculum. That curriculum has been deeply vetted, working with Columbia University and NYU to assess the efficacy of it. And our primary focus is prevention of interpersonal violence. And we use a strength-based approach. So looking to enhance what healthy relationships are, defining consent. And we also work with school districts when there are constraints with, what the curriculum can and cannot address, while still really holding that we all want to create safer communities for our students and deepen the skills necessary for them to navigate challenging situations and maneuver healthy relationships throughout their lifetime. We do teacher trainings to prepare teachers to implement the curriculum in their classrooms, as well as getting the information to further their own knowledge. We support students when they have feel activated and called into action. So we've had students want to do projects that have resulted in education nights for the community. We also can help support and facilitate parent education nights. So again, we have a K through 12 curriculum looking at primary prevention of first time and ongoing perpetration and victimization of sexual and relationship violence. We use a social emotional learning model, and again, are very strength-based in trying to help youth gain the skills necessary in order to create safe communities, because we trust and know they have the capacity to do that if they are supported in gaining the skills and the knowledge and the wherewithal in order to be able to do those things. So I'm going to turn it back over to Allie to give us over to our guest speaker this evening. Well, I guess it depends on where you're at in the country, but welcome, and I'm happy everyone's here.
Thanks so much, Amy. So just some housekeeping before we begin. I want to let you know that we're going to have a Q&A session after the presentation, brief Q&A. You all submitted some really great questions during your registration, but if any more arise, you can feel free to just drop them in the chat box or in the Q&A, and we'll try our best to get to them. We do have a lot of questions. We received a lot of questions, and there's no way we're going to be able to get to all of them this evening. And some of you had some very specific, wonderful questions about how to support nonverbal students and students with disabilities. We will not be discussing that this evening, but I want to let you know, rest assured, if your question doesn't get answered, or if there were resources that you're looking for specifically, we will be sending out a post-workshop follow-up in the next day or two. We have a lot of resources and not enough time to share them with you all tonight, but we will be sending you something in a couple of days to try to help answer some of those really wonderful questions that you submitted. So be on the lookout for that. So let's get going. We're so privileged to have Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor with us today. Mary Frances is an associate professor of clinical psychology and psychiatry at the University of Arizona, and she conducts studies to better understand the grief process both psychologically and physiologically. She is a leader in the field of complicated grief, a clinical condition in which people do not adjust to the acute feelings of grief and show increases in yearning, avoidance, and rumination. Her work primarily focuses on trying to tease out the mechanisms that cause this ongoing and severe reaction to loss. Her book, The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss, is available for purchase on her website. I'll be dropping that link in the chat shortly, and it's an excellent resource for learning more about her work. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. Dr. O'Connor, welcome.
It is so wonderful to be here this evening, and I'm going to try and share my screen now. See if that works out. There we go. I think that worked. It's just so lovely to be with all of you this evening. I'm very honored to be asked by Nest to do this presentation. I'm so impressed with Nest and the work that they're doing. And the title of this is very simply grief and loss. I was thinking a great subtitle would be How We're All More Like Kids Than We Think. And so a lot of what I will talk about this evening is about grief and loss as an adult. But I think that the way that I go about it will make it really clear ways in which this applies to children. And certainly also the knowledge that when we are more comfortable with our own grief, we do a better job supporting others who are grieving, including kids. So, over the past 20 years, I've been studying grief and grieving. And, the brain isn't always the first thing. You don't go, oh, neuroscience, of course, that's what we would look at to think about grief and grieving. But I've always wondered not just how grief feels. Lots of good stuff written about how grief feels, and that's incredibly important. It makes you feel more normal when someone else is feeling the same things that you have felt. But my interest has been very much in why. Why does it take us so long to understand that this person is really gone and what that means for our life? And how does the brain, make sense of this world without our loved one who should be there? And so I think, through my research, through this past couple of decades, and also through my personal experience, I've really felt that this work needs to be in the hands of people who can really use it. And so in my own life, my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer when I was 13. And she was not supposed to live through the year, which of course I didn't know at 13 because we didn't talk about that. But I knew that grief came to our house, certainly. And her oncologist called her his first miracle. She lived another 13 years, which felt like a gift from the universe for my sister and I. And so she died when I was 26, which is still pretty young. And so I think, between this personal experience and then the research studies that I've been doing, where I get to interview hundreds of people who are experiencing the shattering loss of someone they love, I've really come to believe that we can think of grieving as a form of learning. And hopefully for many of you, that will just open the possibility that grieving is a little more familiar than you might think, because we're all learning all the time. And you as educators are experts in learning. And so I want to talk through why I think grieving is a form of learning, but hopefully that's a framework that you can hold on to as we talk this evening and as you work in your own life to understand what the death of this person means, and as you work with children who are trying to understand what it means for them that they're missing this person. Now, a place that I like to start is making a distinction between grief and grieving. Grief is different from grieving, and I want to talk about that because I think it helps to understand that we can feel grief over the loss of someone anytime that we become aware that they're no longer with us. And that can happen days, weeks, months, years after a loved one has died. We're going to feel grief. If this is the time of year when in Trader Joe's, we get the JoJo's, the peppermint JoJo's that show up. And darn it, every single time I start thinking about my dad, because we used to eat them together, in large quantities at Christmas. And when I'm sitting in Trader Joe's or standing in Trader Joe's and I have that wave of grief, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with my grieving. Having the feeling of grief doesn't mean you've done anything wrong up to that point. And so grief is just the natural response to loss. It is that human experience in the moment. We get better at learning to cope with grief over time. And it is the change over time that is grieving. So that, the first 100 times you have that wave of grief, you think, oh my gosh, this is unbearable. Like, I'm not even going to get through this moment. But the 101st time, it still feels just as bad. But now it feels also familiar. You know what this is. And over time, you get better at coming to understand how you might cope with that moment that grief sneaks up on you. And you might learn how to comfort yourself in that moment, so that it's not that we ever expect grief goes away completely. It's just a natural human emotion. But through grieving and learning over time, we're less surprised by it. It probably happens less frequently or less intensely, but it doesn't happen in some linear set of stages. So just for clarity, research has really demonstrated it isn't a direct line from the experience at the beginning to some endpoint that doesn't really exist. So we no longer really rely on those 5 stages of grieving, but we think about over time, people end up having more and more acceptance, and they tend to have less and less yearning. And that is sort of the mentally healthy change over time that we're looking for. So why does grieving take so long? And I think this has really puzzled me even as a neuroscientist, right? So I also am a teacher. I teach here at the university, and I have an undergraduate class where I teach psychology of death and loss. It's about 150 students. And you know how this is. They all sit in the same place every time they come to class, and you get to know, oh, this is the student who always talks too much, and this is the student who always has the right answer. And at the end of the term, they all go away. And the next time you teach the class, a different group of students walk into that room and sit in those seats. And I never think to myself, where is that student who always knew the answer? And that is because that's a one trial learning, right? They're going to walk out of the room and I'm not going to expect to see them again. That isn't how it works when we're bonded to someone, when we deeply, deeply love someone. Instead, it takes a very long time to understand that they're really gone. And what does that mean for our life? And what's so interesting to me, just fascinating about the human brain, is that for the brain, your loved one is gone and everlasting at the same time. This is part of what makes learning so hard. So what I mean by that is, of course, you have a memory system in your brain, and you have memories of the fact that the death has happened. Maybe you were there caring for the person at their bedside when they died. Maybe you got that terrible phone call, or you remember being at the memorial or the funeral. The reality is that they're gone. And you have a memory system in your brain that can inform you of that. But when we are attached to someone, we also have this deep belief that they will always be there for you and you will always be there for them. And that is actually encoded in our neurobiology, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the problem, of course, is these things can't both be true. We can't both, on the one hand, know that they have died and they're not coming back, and also know that they are out there somewhere waiting for us. And yet we can believe both of those things. And this is why we get, behavior that seems really weird even to ourselves. You pick up the phone to text, to text someone what's happened in your day, and then you realize, oh, gosh, I can't text them. Or you see a birthday card in the grocery store and you think, oh, that would be the perfect birthday card for my dad. Except my dad isn't going to have birthdays anymore. And so these are sort of pieces of why we can have these strange beliefs, that feeling of, I feel like they're just going to walk through the door again, because our brain is really listening to both streams of information, even though they can't both be true. It takes a long time to be able to predict the absence of this person. And so I think one of the things that's really important is you can't really understand grief without first understanding love and bonding. And what I mean by that is, when you fall in love with the person who becomes your spouse, or when you fall in love with your baby, there are actually epigenetic changes that happen in your brain because of that relationship. We partly know this through the research done on these little tiny rodents called voles, and they pair bond for life. They meet a vole, they fall head over heels for this vole, and they will now prefer that vole for the rest of their life compared to any other vole. When that happens, we know that there are these epigenetic changes that happen in the specific part of the brain. And more importantly, once that bond is formed, when there is separation, it automatically means that we get, for example, decreased oxytocin binding in that area of the brain. What that means is, as soon as the bond is there, we are set up. The gun is cocked, so that when there is separation, we are going to have this experience of grief. It's not a choice. It is really happening in your brain. And what's so fascinating is this particular little area of the brain, very small area, very central in the middle of your head. It is actually an area of the brain that we see in human beings as well. So this is a study that I did, asking individuals to come into the lab, bring me a photograph of the person who had died. I'm able to scan that into a computer and then show it to them while they're lying in the neuroimaging scanner. So I can take photos of the activation of their brain while they're looking at this person who's died. And activity in exactly that same region when they're looking at a person who's died and having that wave of grief. It is associated with activity in that area, so that the amount of yearning for that person that they described in an interview with me correlates with the amount of activity in this brain region. I think this is really important for many people. I think there's this sense of, if you can see it happening in the brain, that it's real. Well, I mean, of course, we knew it was real before in a certain sense, but there's a way in which seeing the physiology of it is very convincing. I don't know. I think it helps people to feel like this is really happening to me. This isn't just something I'm kind of making up. How do we think then about how children might understand grief? I will tell you straight out, I don't do research with children, and I have not looked at neuroimaging scans of children who are grieving. I'm not aware of any neuroimaging in young people yet about grief and grieving. But this is part of what we know about children. Cognitively, children are not always yet able to understand the abstract aspects of death. They don't necessarily understand that when grandpa died, that really means grandpa's never coming back. Or if a pet dies, that you can't sort of dig them up again and play with them again. This is because death is a really abstract concept. And frankly, it's pretty hard for adults to figure out as well. I just told you we have often this experience of sort of, I feel like they're going to walk through the door again. And though we're rational enough to know that that's not true, technically, it doesn't mean that we don't sometimes act on the fact that we still feel like we're connected to this person. So this is because of attachment neurobiology. Attachment neurobiology, this bond with someone, it motivates us to come back together again, doesn't it? When we, I was recently on a trip in London with my partner, and, we even had a plan, right? What if one of us gets on the tube and the other one doesn't make it on? We need some emergency plan so we'll be able to find each other again. Because finding each other again is as important to human beings as food and water. And so that motivation to seek out our loved one doesn't have to be in our presence for us to believe that they are out there. You couldn't let your spouse go off to work every day or your kids go off to school if you didn't have that deep belief that everyone was going to do everything they can to come back together again. And so the brain has a solution for when our loved one isn't there. And the solution is go and get them, or make enough of a fuss that they come and get you. That is the solution to your loved one not being present. And for a while, that is still what the brain is trying to do, even though they've died. And so for children, the reality is they may not completely understand death. They may not understand all the things that go on when a loved one dies and how that's going to affect their life, but they understand deeply missing someone, because in their world, just being separated in a permanent kind of way from someone they deeply love, it has all those physiological reactions that they really are thinking about it as though this person is missing, even if they're not fully able to understand that they've died. And so if you think about that, here's one of the real challenges. When a loved one is missing, I said a moment ago, the solution is to go find them or to make enough of a fuss that they come and get you, right? I know that if I did miss the tube, that my partner would do everything in his power to find me, and he knows that I would do the same. So here's the difficulty. If someone left you with no explanation, just didn't turn up one day, you might feel really angry about that. Or you might feel really guilty about that. Why have they not come back for me? Or how dare they just disappear from my life? And I think then if we realize that part of the brain is just thinking that they're missing, I think that really helps to understand some of those intense emotions that we have when we're grieving. And so there's sadness and missing and yearning, which we typically think of with grief. But there's all those other feelings as well. Feeling of being angry at the person who died, angry at the doctor who didn't save them, angry at oneself for, not having gotten them to quit smoking or, whatever. We just feel really angry. I'll give an example. In my group of friends, one of the young men in my group of friends, his mother died. And it was about 3 or 4 months later, and they'd been out golfing and we're all standing around in the parking lot. And he just said something really mean and kind of blew his stack. And we were all sort of like, what is happening? And I said to our friends later, guys, it's only been like 3 months since his mom died. And we got to cut him some slack. I mean, we weren't talking about his mom, but it doesn't mean that all those intense emotions aren't happening for him. And I reached out to him and he said, I'm really embarrassed, that I did that. He said, it's so hard to be with you, all of you who are so happy. And I know I should be happy, but I'm just not. I just feel awful. And sometimes being with you is really hard and it makes me angry. So I think that's an example of how it doesn't have to be super rational. It's like the emotion dial gets turned up on all the emotions. But I think the other emotion then that makes a lot more sense sometimes is feeling guilty. This is a real issue for all people who are grieving, but this is a way that we're a lot like kids. Kids very frequently think that the death happened because of something they did, or more accurately, that the person has gone away because of something they did. Now, this isn't always a very worked out rational argument for how this all might have happened. It's just a feeling that mom didn't come back for me, or my brother didn't come back for me. And the best I can figure out is that they didn't want to, and that there's something about me that means they didn't want to. So even young adults who can understand death will often tell me that they feel extremely guilty about the arguments that they had with a parent or a grandparent before they died. And that is this sense of, I should have been a better person. And even though they may not logically sort of say to you, and then they wouldn't have died, the implication is, I wasn't a good enough child or grandchild, and I feel guilty about how we left things. Of course, we all know that all young adults are arguing with their parents, and usually that does not end in one person dying. And so those arguments take on less of a guilty feeling when we have plenty of time in life to apologize, or even just to grow up a little bit and sort of, understand our parents better, understand ourselves better, and why we were at loggerheads. But death sort of robs us of the opportunity to grow through that relationship until we're able to understand each other. So I think it can be really helpful to keep in mind that the emotions that we feel are not necessarily rational. There can be a lot of beliefs that adults, but especially children, may have about how it might be related to them, even though the death, of course, is not related to them. And they may need us to really listen, because those things, they don't necessarily make a lot of sense. They're not very easy to say. They come with a lot of emotion, which often a lot of emotion makes it hard to describe what we're experiencing. This is true for adults as well, but especially true for children who don't have a lot of language yet to talk about their emotions and to be able to explain their thoughts to you. I think that another thing that is really important is the idea of helping them to recognize that this is normal, that all of these feelings are feelings that people have when a loved one dies. And to some degree, to even allow them to tolerate that they are feeling this. Another example from my group of friends, actually a couple of my friends lost their mom in quick succession. And one of my friends, she had 2 teenage sons, so their grandmother had died. And it was very helpful for these 2 friends when we were together. Sometimes they would talk about the grief they were having over their moms, and it was really helpful for them. And one of these times, I think we were, like watching football at a bar or something, and they were talking about their moms. And her son, her younger son, who was maybe a sophomore in high school, was like, "Mom, let's not talk about this. This is so depressing." And she turned to him and she said, "Hon, it's really helpful for he and I to talk about this. And I know that it's really hard, but it's really important. And I think it's okay I think you can stick with it for a little while because it's important to us. And I think that just giving permission for people to have really strong emotions that you're not supposed to have, I think it's really powerful to get that message that it's okay. Now, what we do with those emotions is a whole other story, right? But having those emotions is completely normal. And this comes back a little bit to what I was saying at the beginning. We sometimes forget grief isn't just an emotion. Grief is a physiological reaction. Think of those little voles. They don't have a lot of prefrontal cortex, right? They're just reacting to being separated from their mate. They probably don't have a concept of death either. And yet we see all the same cortisol stress hormones that are increased in them. We see all sorts of other changes, just like we do in human beings. And children are human beings too. And so, the reason it's so difficult for people to eat or so difficult for people to sleep when they've lost a really close loved one is partly because their physiology is all over the place. It's like drinking coffee continuously and then trying to go to sleep. You're going to have insomnia. Your body is making a physiological reaction because of the separation of this bond that's encoded in your brain. And so for children's grief can often look like what might be called big energy. And that comes in lots of different forms. But how to manage big energy, that's an important question. Now, as I said, I'm not an expert in children, but I can tell you that there are fantastic resources that are available. I want to tell you about a book called Giving Hope, that's written by a doctor and a PhD, Elena Lister. That'll be on your list of resources. And then there's a bunch of resources that I've given to Nest that they will send out. But the Dougie Center, which is one of the very first sort of bereavement support organizations for children specifically, there are resources at the Dougie Center that you can get to online, but there are now numerous centers around the country that are specifically designed to do bereavement support for children. Here in Tucson, Arizona, it's called Tunadito, and Tunadito has a lot of resources in Spanish as well, because we have a large Mexican Spanish-speaking population here. But what I'm showing you here is just two examples. Another one that I'll point out is this National Alliance for Grieving Children at childrengrieve.org. Tons of resources, really well done, short. They give you activities you can do, ways to connect. And importantly, they do it sort of at different ages so that it's more relevant to the developmental stage of the child. So you see, for example, you can think about for preschoolers, just, these 4 emojis even. Just being able to name for children, I saw that you stopped playing, jump rope with your friends and you're over here, during recess by yourself. So you're pointing out a behavior. That makes me wonder if maybe you're sad. Often people do that when they're feeling sad. And sometimes when you're missing your mom, you feel sad. Is that sound like something you're feeling? I think always checking in with them to make sure that you're not putting words in their mouth can be really helpful. And of course, confused can be equally difficult for them. Sometimes when I've had something really important to me that, when I've had a loss, I don't really know what I feel, but I feel a lot of things. Is that how you're feeling? I think for preschoolers then, really focusing on the way they're behaving as indicators of what they might be feeling, but also finding out how do we deal with the fact that they're really disruptive in class, or what do we do with a child who has a stomach ache every morning. I think there are good examples of handling those, but most importantly, even just understanding the way that they may be connected to grief can be really helpful. Of course, at the sort of other end of the spectrum of childhood, you have teenagers who are much more able to process and explain what they're feeling if we are listening, and giving them some ideas about things that they can do is often something that they can do more independently. So to some degree, figuring out, is it hard hanging out with your friends because you might get really upset at some point? Does that make you kind of anxious about spending time with them? And how could you have a conversation with them so that they know to give you a little bit of space if you need it, and to also give you a hug if you need that too? There are good ways of talking through these things. Again, not time in an hour for me to go into this, more to point out that there is a lot known about grief in kids, and that there are some really excellent resources that we'll be able to send you. I just want to end today by thanking people who support the research that I do, especially my many graduate students who have contributed, and to thank Nest very much for this opportunity, and all of you for really wanting to connect and understand this human universal experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Frances. That was so wonderful. And I think we're gonna jump right off of that right into the Q&A, because I think obviously a lot of the things that you touched on are gonna we're gonna be able to kind of tease those out a little bit more as we go into the Q&A. So I think that it was great to hear you talk about sort of ways that children express grief. Could you talk a little bit more about like the cognitive indicators of grief, either in adults, in children, if you know any of that? Because that was a question from one of our participants.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is so important to remember that your brain is doing a lot of work when you're trying to learn that this person is gone. And so, you think about it, everything you do in your day-to-day life may have involved this person. And so grocery shopping is suddenly different. The laundry is different. Doing your taxes is different, right? Every single thing requires that somewhere in the background, your brain is trying to update how do I do this now? And I think that it can be useful to recognize that can cause a lot of concentration problems. And I think of it this way. If you're working on your computer, you're working on a Word document on your computer, and something is updating in the background, you know how the Word document slows down and you can't get the letters won't come out as you're. I think that thinking is very similar. You're trying to focus on this task you're doing, but at the same time, there's a lot of updating going on, and that's going to slow you down. It's going to make it harder to remember what you were trying to do, to encode what people are telling you, to remember what people are telling you. And so knowing that this concentration difficulty is really normal, and for the vast majority of us does go away, can be really reassuring. For children, that can look a few different ways. So for children, remember, a lot of cognition is also about just sort of like managing themselves. And so one of the things we see a lot is what we call regression. So that, for example, a child who has been potty trained may suddenly start wetting again. And you can think about it, it seems kind of funny, but the same idea is going on. As the child is trying to understand what's happening, they're not able to work at the level they were before, even though that work is sort of regulating themselves. And so it doesn't sound like concentration, but I think it is in a funny sort of way.
That's really interesting, and really I think will be helpful information for some of our attendees who are working directly with children as teachers, as counselors, as healthcare providers. Are there any things beyond what you've expressed already? Are there any techniques or tools that they could possibly use to help children work through their grief and understand and deal with their grief?
Boy, I think I will largely rely on the resources for this, but I will say that, grief education is a thing that we can do, just like we educate children around all kinds of emotions, right? And so one thing that we can do is just to normalize talking about grief. And that can be not even for a specific child, but for a classroom. For example, I work with a group of young people who we call opportunity youth. They're disconnected from work or school for a variety of reasons. And with this group, they really identified that grief is the loss of someone close to them is often part of what got them really off track. And so we've been doing a number of things, including bereavement support groups that sort of allow them in a very safe environment to open up and talk about their experience and hear from their peers who they don't hear from very often, the experience that they're having. But something that we've done is we are in the Southwest. And in November, we've done a Dia de los Muertos celebration. And so it means that all of the youth get together and we make posters for people that we may have lost. And it gives us an opportunity to express some of that. What were they like? What did they mean to us on this poster? It does that without having to necessarily talk about it really explicitly with each other, but you can get into a conversation with them. And then we walk with the posters. We also make paper flowers, which is a big Dia de los Muertos thing. And we set up an altar and we put all of them out. And the people that, these youth are sort of memorializing vary from, the rapper who was recently killed to a grandparent, to a friend who died by suicide. And so just the fact that we're giving them permission to just express that, even in a very non-one-on-one kind of way, actually, I think has allowed them to open up and talk with each other when we're not even there. So that's a possibility to think of it also as grief education and not just one-on-one.
How beautiful. That sounds like a really beautiful, wonderful healing experience. I would love to hear you talk about something that really struck me when you were speaking was the feelings of guilt that can come up and the feelings of regret. Yeah. And it would be great if you could talk a little bit more about how do we deal with those feelings?
Yeah. I think, something that is often done, especially when there wasn't an opportunity to have a conversation before the person died. So this may be a death that happened unexpectedly. It could be a death that happened far away during the pandemic. It could be almost any death because we were so isolated from each other. But something that is sometimes helpful for people is to write a letter, to actually tell them the things that we wish we had gotten to say, and to offer them gratitude, to ask for forgiveness, to tell them we love them, and to tell them goodbye. And this is quite moving. It's often also helpful in these circumstances to kind of imagine, if you had been able to give them this letter, how might that person have felt? And this is the fascinating thing about the human brain. The opportunity to do that can be very meaningful. The other thing that I would say is reminding all of us, but children as well, and youth, that our relationship with this person isn't defined by the last year of their life, or the last 6 months of their life, or the last argument we had with them. Our relationship to them, that encoding in our brain, takes place over a long period of time. And so our relationship with them actually had many elements, and choosing only to focus on the elements that are really hard doesn't really give a full picture of what your whole relationship was like with that person. And so by sort of broadening your perspective and being able to recall lots of different kinds of memories, that can also be very helpful, because a relationship is lots of things.
That's such a helpful tip. I would love to hear you talk about, we talked about this. I think you talk about this a lot in your book as well, is re-examining this idea of the 5 stages of grief, and this sort of the timeline of grief, the life cycle of grief. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about your research and how you have sort of rethought this long held idea about how we grieve.
Yeah. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was an amazing woman, a psychiatrist, when there were not a lot of women in psychiatry, who had this revolutionary idea that you could talk with people who were terminally ill and ask them what they were feeling, which was just not done. And even today is sometimes not done. But she did what all good scientists do at the beginning. She described what she was hearing, and was also able to apply that to people who were grieving. And so the descriptions that she gave us of what people experience, people do experience depression, they experience denial, they experience anger and acceptance. Those are all accurate, that we experience those when we have grief. But it became used as a prescription, like you have all of denial, and then you have all of anger, and then you have all of, and we know from more recent research that was done in 1969, and think how far science has come since then. We have a lot more research now about grieving, right? So she was really telling us about grief, what grief is like. And now we have a lot more research about grieving. So if you follow the same person over many months and even years, what is that trajectory? What does that change over time look like? And so instead of these sort of really specific stages, we now think more about the fact that over time, there is this general increase in acceptance that this is the painful reality of what has happened. And over time, there is a decrease in yearning as we come to connect more with our living loved ones, as we come to restore a meaningful life while still carrying the absence of that person. And so now we think more about, it's not just a linear improvement. We also know that during the holidays, for example, or at the anniversary of the death, that people tend to have more grief, because grief comes up when you're aware of the person you've lost. And so while it does sort of get easier over time as we learn to cope, that doesn't mean that grief goes away per se. So I think that's helpful, because for many people, there's this sense of, I'm not doing it right? I'm not normal. This should not be happening. And that can come in a lot of different forms, but often people sort of cling on to those 5 stages like, well, I didn't experience anger, so maybe I'm not done yet, and that's not really helpful usually for people, because that isn't necessarily a 100% universal that everyone will experience anger. So we think now more about this trajectory, and are you learning, right? Does it feel different now than it did right after the person died? How do you understand this as a chapter of your life? How do you carry with you the values of this person so that they're sort of always with you? I still write thank you notes, because that concrete gratitude was super important to my mom. And so every time I do it, I'm thinking of her, So I think it's a much more nuanced way of thinking about it than we had previously described.
Wow, that's really beautiful. Really beautiful way to think about it too. And also a reminder that There's no right or wrong way to grieve. And it's as much as I'm sure there are common indicators, it's different for everyone. I think
It really is.
yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, it is so baked into our beliefs about grief and grieving that there is an end point. Like, how long should this take is the most common the most common question I think that I get. And it just doesn't work that way. And, this is sort of a silly thing to say, but this is how I try to describe it. If I ask you, when did you get over your wedding day? Like, that's not really a question that makes any sense. It's an event that happened. It changed you. It changed the way you see the world. It changed how you interact with people in the world. And losing someone is the same way. It is going to change how you understand the world. And you're going to learn a lot about yourself. You're going to learn a lot about your friends. You're going to learn about what, mortality might mean. And those are going to take a long time to sort of sort through. It doesn't mean there's an end point to it, but because there's no end point doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong either. If you are continuing to find ways to have meaningful connections with other people, if there are times in your day when you're able to feel joy or love or be silly, then as long as those things are true, also having a good cry, it's just all part of it.
And would you say, a lot of our attendees asked about how do they cope with their own grief as well? And someone particularly asked, what can I do to balance myself when the emotions become overwhelming or seem too big or too much to handle?
Yeah. This is really important. And I think of it this way. I think it's important to have a really big toolkit of coping strategies, right? And so, I'm not a believer that there are like dysfunctional coping strategies and functional coping strategies. I think what matters more is what's appropriate in the moment, right? So, I grew up in this really tiny rural town. And when my mom died, of course, everyone knew she was in the hospital. And I got up the next morning and went with my best friend to get breakfast to this restaurant. And the owner came over and she said, "Hey, I heard about your mom. I'm really sorry." She said, "What can I get you? You can have anything." And I said, "Can I have a beer?" And she was like, "You can have a beer. It is 8 a.m. and this is totally appropriate," right? Now, it was appropriate in that moment. I needed a little numbness at that moment. If I did that every morning that I woke up from then on, that would start to be a real problem. But you can see what I mean then. It's not that there's anything wrong with that moment of coping. So, when you are really overwhelmed, finding the things that actually bring you comfort, whether that is, I'm just so overwhelmed that I need to get out of this situation and I need to connect with nature, or, even if that means literally going into the parking lot and like looking at the tree, finding something that brings you comfort like that, carrying something. Sometimes people have something they carry that reminds them of their connection to that loved one. And in a funny sort of way, also just accepting. You don't necessarily have to do anything, because the reality is those strong emotions, they're going to rise, they are going to overwhelm you, and then they're going to recede. They're not going to be with you forever. And so sometimes it is even just letting it roll through you, accepting that you are going to break down and have some pretty big Kleenex bills, and knowing that it will move through you and that you will return to not feeling that way in a little bit.
I think that is a really beautiful sentiment to sort of wrap up with today. Mary Frances, I want to just thank you so much. We're so grateful to have you here with us. We're so we're just so pleased to have had the chance to hear you speak and for you to share your work with us. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for bringing this to people. Educators are the most important people in the world, and I'm grateful to, offer my glasses and see if that helps you see through for a little bit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we're going to wrap up here today, folks. I'm going to put up a little slide here. Give me one moment. So if you're able to, we would love for you to take a moment to fill out a really quick survey just to help us to better support your needs. The QR code is here. There's also a link here, and it'll also be in the follow-up email as well. And I just want to thank you all on behalf of Nest. Thank you all for being with us today. Thank you to Dr. O'Connor for being with us today. If your question didn't get answered tonight, please rest assured that we are going to be sending a follow-up in a couple of days, like I said, with a lot of resources, and we'll try to really be thoughtful about answering as much of your questions as we possibly can. In the meantime, if you have any questions or you need any support or you'd like to learn more about Nest, you can email us. I'll drop this email in the chat as well. Or you can just sort of follow up with the registration emails that we sent you. And thank you all so much for joining us again. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. And we hope to see you again at a Nest event in the future. Thank you so much.